Dinosaur, written by Stephen Llewelyn and performed by Chris Barrie. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell to keep up to date with the latest installments.
Douglas entered engineering fully expecting to find some kind of fracas in progress, but despite his preparedness, he was still shocked. Chief Engineer Hiro Nasaki stood to one side, using a console for support while nursing a bleeding lip and a respectable shiner. Sergeant Jackson, a little out of his comfort zone, attempted to offer tender support by asking Nasaki if he still had his wits. In the opposite corner, completely out of control, crewman Giorgio Baccini kicked and scrambled in vain against the hydraulic strength of Private Jones' necklock. Jones was clearly trying not to damage the young man, which left him open to minor injuries himself as the engineer flailed like a mad thing, completely incensed. Of course, hitting the nail-hard Jones was as likely to hurt the hitter as the hittee, and as the adage went, Baccini's actions were only hurting himself.
"What the hell is going on here?"
bellowed Douglas in a quite uncharacteristic flash of temper. The Sarge snapped around into attention in one lightning movement.
"Sir,"
he said,
"we were making one of our regular duty tours of the ship when Private Jones and myself heard what sounded like a heated argument in process. We doubled into the room and found Mr. Nasaki on the floor with Mr. Baccini about to launch himself onto him. We wrestled Mr. Baccini away and I calmed you immediately. I wouldn't normally have interrupted your meeting, Captain, but as our two remaining engineers were going at it, just a day or so before we have to land a damaged ship on a hostile planet, I didn't think it could wait, sir," he finished.
Douglas rubbed his hand down his face in disbelief. "It's all unraveling," he thought, but kept it to himself.
"Quite right, Sarge. At ease,"
he said. He walked over to where Giorgio was still writhing, but the energy of anger was beginning to leave him.
"Thank you, Dowie. Release him, please."
Private Jones relaxed some of the pressure, waiting to see how Baccini would respond before letting him go completely. The young man suddenly found his mojo again and launched himself at the chief, but Douglas was ready for it and caught him.
"Stop!"
he commanded. Baccini, panting heavily with anger and the onset of exhaustion, stopped struggling. Douglas drew his attention, looking him in the eye. "Now, I want you to sit in that chair and then calmly explain to me the meaning of all this." He pointed to the seat at Baccini's usual station.
"But, Captain,"
the young man shouted, moving forward again.
"That's an order, crewman,"
snapped Douglas, louder and with steel in his voice. Baccini sat.
"Now, what's all this about, Giorgio? Why would you possibly want to hurt Hiro?"
"He did it, Captain. He killed Mario. Tried to kill all of us,"
the young engineer spat out, his voice rising.
"Whoa," said Douglas. "Calm down. Now tell me, from the beginning, what makes you believe that?"
Nasaki was shaking his head in disbelief.
"He just flew at me," he said from behind the captain. "I was working under that console. As I stood and turned, he was there, and he hit me with that box. The next thing I knew..."
Douglas turned to face the chief, raising his hands placatingly.
"All right, Hiro. I know you're upset, but you'll get your turn," he said. "Please, you need to go and get that face looked at."
Hiro looked genuinely shocked and outraged. Eventually, mumbling his assent, he left.
Douglas nodded after him, saying, "Go with him, Sarge, and stay with him. Bring him back when he's fixed up, please." "Are you sure you'll be okay, sir?" asked the Sarge. "I've got a soldier next to me who's the size of a horse. I'll be fine, Sarge."
Jackson saluted and strode out after the chief engineer. Jones stood behind Baccini, ready to act should the engineer lose control again. "Now, start at the beginning, Georgie," said Douglas, his more usual kindly manner restored. Baccini sniffed, wiping his eyes.
"Lieutenant Nasaki asked me to fetch a multimeter he'd left in his quarters last night. So I went to get it."
"Was Hiro's door locked?" Douglas interrupted.
"No, Captain. Hiro never locks his door. The only things he owns, other than what he stands up in, are usually to do with his ship and her workings anyway. You know what he's like."
Douglas nodded, considering his one-track-minded engineer.
"I do," he said.
Well, I thought I did too, snapped Pacini vehemently. When I entered his quarters, I started to look for the meter. Hero keeps engineering spotless and woebetide anyone who leaves one of his tools out of place, but his quarters are a nightmare of half-finished electrical projects and spare parts.
Douglas' expression softened slightly, as he imagined how the most committed workaholic on the crew must spend his spare time.
Continue, he urged softly. Well, I couldn't find it at first, but then I noticed the red probe of a meter sticking out from under his bed. I knelt down, and there it was, said Pacini, looking meaningfully at the captain.
The meter? asked Douglas.
Yes, the meter, he said, waving a hand distractedly. But also that box.
Now he pointed to a small black mild steel container with one side completely caved in. Probably from contact with the chief's head, Douglas mused.
The box was open on its side under his bed, and inside it...
He stood and walked across to the box. Private Jones made a move to restrain Pacini, but Douglas held up a hand, forestalling him.
Inside it was this remote,
the engineer said, returning to his seat and passing the box to Douglas.
I wasn't sure what it was at first. I mean, clearly it's a remote controller of some sort.
Douglas looked at the inoffensive little item in the box.
Clearly,
he thought dryly, not having a clue what he was looking at.
I don't know why I did it, continued Pacini, but I thought I'll put the meter across it and see what frequency it sends out. When I did, I couldn't help but notice that the frequency was 60,174.138792 hertz.
The captain waited, but nothing more seemed to be forthcoming, so he prompted the young engineer.
Giorgio, you're going to have to make allowances for us non-geniuses and explain a little further, please.
But that's the exact frequency, Captain. The one used by the bomb Captain Gleason disarmed. If you recall, I was asked to inspect the unit after it had been made safe to see if there might be any clues in its manufacture as to where it may have come from or who made it. I scanned the operational frequency of the unit at 60,174.138792 hertz myself, not 2 days ago, he said,
as though this should be obvious even to a child.
There was a memo, sir.
Douglas sat back, all amusement fading from his eyes. He suddenly felt 20 years older.
Are you sure about this?
He asked eventually. In response, the young man merely nodded, not breaking eye contact.
You should have brought this straight to me, Georgie,
Douglas admonished, trying not to let too much irritation show in his voice. The young man was clearly already in the emotional red zone and nodding vigorously, still charged on nervous energy.
I know, Captain, he replied, but I didn't know a quarter of an hour ago. I didn't know anything then, other than I was holding the thing that was meant to kill us, and it was hidden in the quarters of one of my best friends. The bomb which killed Mario must have been made by the same person, or if not he, then he must have had something to do with it. I knew nothing other than that, sir, and I went mad.
Pacini began to sob gently, his last vestiges of composure collapsing.
Why, Captain? His voice cracked. Why would Hero kill Mario? Why would he want to hurt any of us?
The young Italian put his head in his hands.
Mio fratello, my poor, poor brother.
The name Sargo Lemelisk sprang into the captain's mind unbidden, and would not be shunted aside.
Questions, questions, damned questions, without answers, he thought.
He leaned forward to place a fatherly arm around the young engineer.
I know, son, I know. Let it out,
he soothed, as tears ran down Giorgio's face.
But we've nothing conclusive yet. I know it looks bad for Hero at the moment, but there are still many questions.
He released Pacini, holding him at arm's length. For starters, why would Hero leave something that damning lying around in his unlocked quarters, eh? The man's no fool. Let's hang on to that. I'll find the person who killed your brother, Georgie, I promise you, but I'm not going to give up on Hero yet. It's hard, but can you try and keep an open mind? Until we know for sure. Like you pointed out to me, Mario would never want us to blame the wrong man for this, would he? Giorgio sniffed and wiped his eyes, fixing the captain with a stare loaded with a much older man's sadness and jade.
I can't think any more. Prove me wrong about this, Captain, please.
Douglas left Boccini with Private Jones, asking him to take the engineer to the bar for a stiff drink.
Needless to say, don't get him squatty legless.
He waved a finger. Jones smiled slightly in his grim way.
Yes, sir.
Baines broke up the meeting with the councillors and department heads roughly an hour after Douglas left. She was keen to get down to the captain and find out what had happened. The comm call, with background accompaniment of violence, had really taken the fire out of the discussion as everyone began worrying about this latest calamity.
I'm starting to feel like I'm on one of those ill-fated, cursed sailing ships from days of yore,
Burton commented on his way out. He smiled to cover his unease, but Baines understood the sentiment well enough. "You wish," she said, attempting to lift their spirits. "Some of those guys got to go to Bermuda." He laughed and nodded.
Night, Commander.
Night, Sam. Douglas had changed his mind on the way back to the bridge meeting room, instead redirecting the Sarge and Hero to apartment 2 of the New World's guest quarters. The three now sat on comfortable sofas around the suite's coffee table. Douglas studied his chief engineer, and, it had to be said, one of his closest friends. After an abrupt and rather unsympathetic checkup, Hero had been dismissed from sickbay by Dr. Schultz and bundled to this alternate venue by the chief of security. The black eye Boccini had given him was blossoming beautifully now, and if he wasn't already at maximum truculence, then he was certainly on a steep approach vector. Douglas could fairly commiserate with the engineer, if he was indeed innocent. All of the New World's crew, with the possible exception of Lieutenant Lloyd, were like family to the captain, and he loved each one of them in his way. He felt like his home was being torn apart, and there didn't seem to be a damned thing he could do about it. "Can you tell me anything about this, Hero?" he asked quietly, hardly needing to state what he was referring to. The chief looked down at the floor sadly before answering. "Nothing, sir," he admitted wretchedly. "I just don't know what got into him. We've never had so much as a cross word since Giorgio and Mario joined us 18 months ago. His work's first rate, and we've always gotten along fine, better than fine. He's one of my closest friends, Captain." He shook his head, confusion giving way to emotion. "But I know it's hard to lose a brother," he added heavily. "Do you remember when I lost my own 3 years ago, Captain?" "Aye, I do, Hero." Douglas nodded with understanding. He remembered how long it had taken Hero to seem like himself again. It was about the only time the engineer had taken any leave without being forced. Strangely, it was the Italian twins joining the crew which put the spark of the living back into the chief. The brothers clearly loved one another, despite the usual ribbing of siblings, but rather than being jealous of their relationship, Hero had been nourished by it. Douglas thought back to that time. He had marvelled at the Japanese engineer's largeness of spirit, recognizing that despite his hopeless interpersonal skills, Hero was a genuinely good man.
"You've really no idea what sent him off?"
he asked eventually. Nasaki shook his head miserably, so Douglas told him about the device Boccini found in his quarters. Baines compiled her meeting notes for the captain after the last of the department heads had left. Her work complete, she hailed Douglas to request an update. He invited her to join the gathering in guest apartment 2, but along the way a comm call redirected her down to the pod. She was yet to receive any details of what had transpired in engineering, and subsequently this second incident took her rather by surprise. The door to guest apartment 2 chimed.
"Come,"
said Douglas. Baines entered the room to find Douglas, the Sarge and Hero seated on easy sofas with drinks before them on the coffee table.
"Ah, bad luck. You've just missed Mary delivering the refreshments,"
Douglas stated mischievously. "Au contraire, mon capitaine," retorted Baines. "I just nabbed her down the corridor on her way out. My order will already be en route by now, if I know Mary and her high-speed chalky trolley."
"Serves me right for underestimating the cunning of a woman where coffee and chocolates are concerned, eh?"
Douglas quipped. "I'm glad you're here." "Sorry for the delay, Captain. I was called to a disturbance in the bar down in the pod," replied Baines. Douglas gave her a quizzical look of concern. "What now?" he asked. Baines looked amused. "Well, it turns out that young Mr. Baccini had taken a drink or two with Dowie Jones." The Sarge put his head in his hands.
What have they done?
He asked. "Actually, this may have been my fault," admitted the captain with a slightly pained expression. "I told Dowie to take Giorgio down to the bar for a stiff drink and to look after him."
You told a squaddy to take an emotionally unstable young man to a pub and look after him, sir?
Asked the Sarge with absolutely enough said. Douglas smiled weakly. "Maybe not my best command decision to date," he admitted, looking at Baines. "What have they gotten up to?" "Nothing bad, but the singing was quite loud. Apparently some of the other patrons were a little put out by the lyrics," she said.
Why, what were they singing about?
Asked the Sarge, concerned.
Please tell me it wasn't the one about the Wellingtons.
Baines smirked. "No idea. You know I don't speak a word of Italian, and I've never even met anyone other than Dowie who speaks Cymraeg. But the gestures were pre-Babel. I got those. Anyway, Dowie is assisting the poor lad back to his quarters now. I said I'd talk to them both in the morning, but maybe I'll let it slip my mind."
A better command decision?
Douglas stated ruefully, nodding his tacit consent. Baines seated herself comfortably, leaning forward towards the Sarge. "Wellingtons?" she asked innocently, before noticing Hero's face. "What the hell's happened to you?" she burst out. Douglas explained the earlier situation and Baccini's revelation about the items found in Hero's quarters.
I've asked Doctors Wright and Norris to make this new evidence their top priority, he said tiredly. Hopefully the forensics may show something up this time. But I know for a fact that Georgie touched it, and even my dabs will be on the box. We can but hope. Chief Nasaki was just about to tell us about Sargo Lemelisk. So much has happened in such rapid succession that I've been chasing on the tail of the information, said the Sarge, his manner, as always when admonishing his superiors, exquisitely polite. Baines couldn't help but notice that the Sarge's body language towards Hero was subtly changed too, more like a cat watching a mouse. He made no move, but should that mouse venture too far? Yes, said Douglas, cutting into her thoughts. I'm sorry, Sarge. As security chief, you should have been made aware of any new information or suspicions straight away. It's just been so damn frantic putting out one fire after another. There hasn't been a moment to get together. The Sarge nodded magnanimously. Baines looked back to Hero. So, what can you tell us about Sargo Lemelisk? She asked indirectly. She wondered how the engineer's story would tally with her own research gathered earlier in the day. Hero looked into his coffee cup, but saw only the past. Sargo Lemelisk was... He paused, looking for the right translation, distastefully deciding on an acquaintance of my brother, Aito. I think he was Russian, but I couldn't swear to that. I only met him once, and we conversed in English. He seemed like a lunatic, to be honest. The 2 hours I spent with him... Actually, I'll rephrase that. Spent with my brother, in his presence. He did nothing but rant. Rant about what? Asked Baines. You know, communistical, hard-left fanaticisms, or fantasies, if you'd prefer. He was very much for the total capitulation of the capitalist West, which, considering his birthright, is probably no great surprise, I suppose. What he was doing in Japan, though... Hero sat up straight, puffing his chest out a little. A proud nation of free enterprise, who knows? But there was something more about him, something dangerous, insidious even. I remember thinking at the time that this man, who talked so casually about killing the men of the West, might possibly do more than talk. If you placed a gun in his hand and a convenient row of innocent bystanders for target practice, then watch out. He wanted to kill? Asked Douglas. Who knows for sure? Many of his sort can be all windy trousers, but I have to say, he gave me the creeps, replied Hero. His mangling a couple of British metaphors brought the twitch of a smile to Douglas's face for the briefest instant. My father owned some very large business interests, Captain, and through them
had a lot of dealings with leading politicians across the spectrum. I suppose growing up around this may have sent my brother towards a love of politics. I don't know. It sent me towards engineering. My girl has never lied to me," he said, gesturing all around, intimating the ship which carried them faithfully through the stars. "She always lets me know exactly what she wants," he continued. "My older sister, Himari, runs my father's business empire now. I never wanted it, and my brother, well, that's another story. Anyway, after what my father described as the tipping of democracy into chaos last century, back in our own time, that is," he corrected, his analytical mind not able to let the statement lie, "I was brought up to believe that extremism in anything political is inherently suspect, and that extreme left policies are every bit as dangerous as anything from the extreme right. He used to tell my brother and I that exponents of the far left seemed even worse to him somehow, always imagining themselves on some sort of moral high ground. Needless to say, Ito disagreed, but I never forgot the way Father described it to me. He likened this kind of politics to a nouveau religious intolerance for the modern age. So convinced of their righteousness, the noisier types can't be reasoned with, and are capable of all manner of atrocities against any who disagree with their often insane ideals. They may even seek to bring down their own nation, if they don't get what they want. Often, they operate well outside the boundaries of self-interest or even self-preservation, with concepts of law and democracy meaning little to them, unless it suits their purposes at that moment. It seems the proof is still with us, even when you throw man into the Mesozoic. Lunatics. I think Lemelisk was such a man. I still hope we can prove that Jeff Lloyd is not."
He looked down at his hands, slumping further into his seat.
"My brother bought into the beliefs of the group he'd fallen in with at university. Father was convinced he would grow out of it, but of course, he never got the chance."
Hero paused again, struggling against weariness and painful memories. He continued,
"Hard right schism, division, and hierarchical bullying without conscience represent one form of evil, but are usually based in self-interest. All politics aside, self-interest is something most of us can understand deep down, to a degree at least, whether we like to admit it to ourselves or not. And if you understand something, you can fight it, out in the world or within yourself. Father told me that good men open their minds and drive these primitive, basic desires from their hearts."
Hero smiled to himself.
"I do my best, Father,"
he added quietly in Japanese.
"But when someone's political agendas make no sense," he continued in English, "are perhaps even self-destructive, you can really find yourself at sea."
He drank to ease his throat. He couldn't remember the last time he had talked so much.
"We may have no idea what kind of insanity we're up against here, or who's really pushing the buttons. My father's companies supplied much material for the Mars program, and this may have been the reason why my brother came to Lemelisk's notice, given recent events. Father would never have given him the time of day. Growing up, I remember the ceaseless political maneuvering around this mission. I couldn't understand why anyone would put the importance of money or politics before the saving of our entire race. By the time I got to university, this was still before my brother met Lemelisk, I think I had just started to work out for myself that the pendulum never stops in the middle. Sensible men are rarely militant men. Casting their votes quietly, they make little noise, even though their numbers are usually greater. People like Sargo Lemelisk slavishly follow leaders who lie or preach this and that, but whose only real interests are themselves and their own power. Although maybe I'm underestimating him there, perhaps he just bought into the ranting to get a slice of the power himself."
The anger on the engineer's face was replaced with sadness as he drifted back to conversations and days gone by with his father and brother.
"When I met Lemelisk, I remember feeling dirty, almost tainted, just being around the guy. The way he spoke about people, simply because their beliefs differed from his, was contemptible. It was like his understanding was absolute, and we were merely fascists. As is often the case with his type, the facts he touted wouldn't have convinced a child. As long as they are kept from power or responsibility, they're laughable, really. He was a fool, and I would have walked straight out the door had it not been such a while since I'd seen Aito, and I'd been really looking forward to spending time with him. He sighed. Anyway, long story short, my brother became more and more involved with Lemelis, who, in turn, seemed to become ever more radical and dangerous. I believe this association may have been what got Aito killed.
I'm sorry to ask, but how did your brother die? Inquired Baines gently. Hiro tugged at his ear again, a faraway look in his eyes. The tension in the room was palpable as he gathered his thoughts. He opened his mouth to answer, but was interrupted as the door chimed.
"Come,"
said Douglas. A large border collie barreled into the room, followed by a tea trolley and further back by a red-cheeked Mary Hutchins. I'm sorry he followed me up here, she puffed. I just came for your empties. Would anyone like a top-up while I'm here? The dog made an exuberant round of the seated two legs, slamming chair and human legs alike with his tail. He finally settled next to Hiro, with his back to the sofa leaning slightly against the engineer's shin, occasionally glancing up over his right shoulder into Hiro's face. Hiro had little experience with animals, but felt strangely comforted by this. He knows you're upset, said Baines, thinking of a dog she had known as a child. It belonged to one of her English cousins. How she wished for one of her own, but moon-based New Florida didn't allow animals in those early days. If you're ill or feeling low, they sense it, or smell it, or whatever they do, but they know. They're really good at sensing people's character, too. He seems to have acquitted you. Now all we need is the evidence to back it up, she finished, her eyes twinkling at the pair. Or should I say, bark it up. Douglas gave her a patient look of sufferance, but Mary spoke before he could answer. I'm real sorry, she said, clearly embarrassed. He belongs to Dr. Natalie Pearson. She tried to get the dog to move. Come on, boy, come on! Reaver appeared to have lost all of his hearing. When Hutchins stood in front of him, he looked away, studying a fascinating chair in the corner of the room. Baines laughed at the dog's impudence. Don't worry, Mary. Tell Natalie I'll bring him back down to the pod later. She watched the young engineer stroking the dog's head awkwardly and being rewarded with a look of guileless friendship. Hiro was smiling as he looked down into Reaver's innocent and yet uncannily wise brown eyes. Reaver reciprocated his smile in that distinctively border collie, white teeth and lolling tongue kind of way, as he tolerated the clumsy affection of a new two-leg friend not yet fully trained. Tell her that Reaver's presence is required at a top-level staff meeting, Baines said jovially. Sometimes animals can tell us all we need to know about each other, she added, glancing meaningfully at Douglas, who caught her implication. As for the Sarge, perhaps he would have been more open to doggy charm had he not still been in full cat mode.
I suggest we continue this conversation tomorrow after we've slept, said Douglas. We're all exhausted, and it's not like Lemelisk is a priority for us out here.
He waited for Mary to leave before continuing quietly.
Look, Hiro,
the evidence against you may be circumstantial and far from conclusive, but it is alarming. We have to treat it with the utmost seriousness. He raised his hand to forestall any comments.
Although, as captain, I've got to look into this rigorously for the sake of all the souls aboard this ship. Speaking as your friend, I don't believe any of it.
Hiro's relief was palpable.
Thank you, Captain. I can't tell you how much that means to me. I would never knowingly hurt anyone, especially not my friends on this ship.
Ah, yes, said Douglas. And that's the rub right there.
Captain? Asked Baines. Douglas looked at Hiro for a long moment before speaking.
We'll go through all this tomorrow, but very simply, we may not believe that Hiro would cause harm to this ship or this crew knowingly. But what if there are other forces at work here?
At the risk of repeating myself, Captain? She asked again. Douglas gave her a half smile.
We were all at Canaveral for weeks before our launch. If someone managed to smuggle a bomb on board, and we know that Captain Gleason's mining explosive haven't been tampered with, I checked with Gleason and then double-checked with the pod's quartermaster who works under Burton, just in case Gleason might be under suspicion himself. If someone could get a bomb on board, then what else could they do to us whilst we're swanning around Civvy Street, eh?
You thought Gleason might be a suspect? Asked Baines, surprised.
Yes, if a rather obvious one given his background in explosives, replied Douglas.
But he risked his life disarming a bomb and saved us all.
Yes, but who's to say he didn't plant it to disarm it? It was found and disarmed in very short order, and we've only his word that it was ever live.
Baines whistled. Remind me never to play poker with you.
He gave her a tight smile. You'll lose.
I don't doubt it, Baines confessed, a little taken aback.
Don't worry, Commander, replied Douglas calmly. I believe that Captain Gleason is the real deal, but that's exactly my point. Given a fistful of facts and a whole lot of people who don't know each other very well, you could point anything at anybody. However, that's not going to happen here. We know Hero very well, and the sort of man that he is.
I believe you knew nothing of this, said Douglas, looking directly at the engineer.
Thank you, Captain, Hero replied seriously.
Is there a butt peeking around the corner here? Asked Baines.
Douglas sighed. I'm sorry, but there is, he admitted.
When we were living at Canaveral, the terrorists who plotted the attack on our ship may have been able to get to us. I'm sorry, Hero, but what if you were drugged, or manipulated, for God's sake, hypnotized? Who knows for sure, he said, throwing his hands in the air.
An uncomfortable silence fell.
Do you think that I did it, but don't remember, Captain?
Asked Hero, his nervousness obvious from the quiver in his voice.
Reva snuggled closer, looking up, scanning equipment as sensitive as anything imagined by the genius of man, spotting the change in his new friend instantly.
I'm saying, Douglas said carefully, that it's no impossible.
Hero nodded thoughtfully.
I don't believe I've done anything wrong, Captain, but I understand your position. What do you suggest we do?
Well, I'm not going to chuck you in the brig with Lloyd, if that's what you're asking. The truth is we can't say with any certainty how that remote detonator came to be in your quarters yet, but, to be on the safe side, I'm going to ask you to stay in these quarters under guard for the time being.
Captain,
Hero pleaded.
Sorry, Lieutenant, but I'm responsible for all the lives on this ship, including yours. The commander will arrange to have some of your things brought up here tonight. You'll have to remain here until this is over.
Can't I at least stay in my own quarters, Captain?
Douglas's expression was a mixture of sadness and discomfort as he answered.
Hero, we need to search your quarters with a full forensic sweep. You must see that.
The engineer deflated further.
I understand, Captain. I won't make a fuss,
he acquiesced in a small voice. Douglas looked at his friend, feeling his heart break. He almost wished the man would rail against him.
I hate this, Hero, but it's only until we can get the situation cleared up. However, that leads me on to our next problem. He sat upright. The New World is damaged.
He held his hand out flat, tilting it left and right.
Aerodynamically, despite running simulations, we're not really sure how she's going to behave in atmosphere.
Hero nodded assent.
Also, Douglas counted on his fingers, we've got one ship's engineer in the brig, my chief's confined to quarters, a third who is bent all out of shape with grief, and worst of all, one deceased.
As he spoke, his voice broke with exhaustion.
We have 2 stand-in engineers from the pod, sterling fellows I don't doubt, but with only a rudimentary knowledge of the ship's architecture and systems. Despite having a first-rate pilot in Sandeep, we are likely to have to monitor, adjust and repair literally on the fly as we descend. We're going to be fighting to stop the ship from being atomized on entry, and we'll worry about the entry-re-entry tents later. And all without an engineering staff? The truth is,
Douglas held his hands open, palms up to the room. I'm not sure we can land this bird the way things are.
Dinosaur, written by Stephen Llewelyn and performed by Chris Barrie. New installments uploaded each week. Subscribe for more. Visit the link in the description for free New World companion stories, available for download as ebooks.